to the Praxis Report, the podcast where theory meets practice and where politics and current events are dissected through a revolutionary lens. We're your hosts, Jonathan Brown and William Barth. Join us in conversation as we share our analysis that goes beyond the headlines. Whether you're seeking to understand the deeper current events that shape our world, or you're looking to engage in transformative ideas, let the Praxis Report be your guide.
Great to be back here with you, William.
Great to be back with you too, John.
So we're going to continue discussing our conversations about the 2024 elections. And today, William and I thought we should go into a little bit of the history of the presidential elections, particularly presidential primaries in the Democratic Party. This is something that we've both been interested in. I wrote my master's thesis on the Democratic Party primaries, and when I was writing it, this was in 2018, so it was mostly going up to the 2016 election with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. But that's something we think is important to look at, to see the sort of behind the scenes machinations that happen, the inter-party politicking that goes on, that kind of sort of undermines our democracy when we look at our election and its processes.
Right. And, John, this is a question and an issue that has been going on for almost a half a century now. For the baby boomer generation, for example, this whole movement of reform within the Democratic Party, for example, has been something that's been going on for a half a century, beginning with the efforts to unseat an incumbent Democratic president during the height of the Vietnam War. We've had, the candidacies of people like, who are now long gone, Eugene McCarthy, Robert F. Kennedy, George McGovern. These were anti-war leaders who said that, or who felt, not only felt, but for lack of an alternative, fought for reform internally within the Democratic Party. And for much of the progressive anti-war coalitions, this was the only approach that we could take. In other words, there really were no alternative paths to anti-war, pro-peace initiatives other than reform within the Democratic Party. So this is an issue that's been long-standing, even long before Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Squad and these other relatively new initiatives that seek similar ends.
Yeah, and that's a good history. And that's kind of the big question we want to try to get at today. Is we want to talk about how, or I guess the question is, can the Democratic Party be reformed from within? Because what you mentioned Eugene McCarthy in the 60s with the Vietnam War, or we look at Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, the big question that was pushed there was, can the Democratic Party be a vehicle for a socialist or anti-war movement? Or will the Democratic Party be a graveyard for the socialist movement, where it incorporates the sort of radical element and then defangs it of any of its actual politics? And so that's a question that we have, like you said, we've been debating that for the past 50 years. And to this day, we're still stuck in this conundrum of what do we do and how do we break out of this endless cycle of defeat?
Right, because once you make a decision one way or another, there are consequences. So if you take the position, for example, that some pundits are currently taking, that the Democratic Party is just not reformable and you cannot work within it, then there's a consequence to that approach. Because then what are you offering, for lack of a better term, what are you offering the masses? Do you have a strategic remedy, a party or an organization that is potentially as powerful as the Democratic Party that you can promote, that can compete, that can make change? Does that even exist? And if it doesn't exist, what are you sentencing?
Well, and you and I have always been
the anti-war left too.
Right. You and I have always been we've always been supportive of third party candidates, third party programs. But one of the things that I think you and I would both agree on is that we want these third parties to become mass political parties, not sort of these fringe vanity campaigns that have no real effect on the political process. And that's something we've spoken about in regards to the Green Party, is whether the Green Party can be a mass party or whether it's sort of just a fringe party that runs every 4 years and then disappears off the radar.
Yeah, I don't like to self promote or bring sort of provincial stories in, but even
Yeah.
my own personal journey, I was a very active Democrat. I was actually elected as a Democratic Party official from the Los Angeles area for several terms. But I have been a member of the Green Party, an official member of the Green Party now for the last three election cycles. So or two or three election cycles. So I am a member. Just full disclosure, I'm a member of the Green Party. But but our discussion today is not here for the purpose of promoting the Green Party or any other particular third party. It's to analyze the broader question, which is the relative powerlessness, the lack of effectiveness of an anti-war progressive movement in this country. And if we are going to make a decision like you can work with the Democratic Party or you can't work with the Democratic Party, you have to have some kind of a strategy, an ideology or a philosophy and a program that makes sense, that can offer the masses of people who do oppose war something that's meaningful and politically, credible, as opposed to simply making, as you say, some symbolic statement.
Right.
And that's problematic, and it's what we want to address here.
Well, let's try to get into a little bit into the history. You want to go into the history with the system of presidential elections? I think we can start there and kind of go from the up through the 20th century up to the present, so that we can see how we got to where we are.
Okay, let's do that.
So, like, the main thing that I always think of is when the country was founded, the Constitution itself doesn't directly specify how parties are to nominate a candidate for the presidency, and in fact, it doesn't really specify that there are parties or not. And like famously, George Washington, the first president, he advised that he doesn't think there should be political parties or what he called factions. But essentially, it sort of came to be in the 1800s that the political parties considered themselves private groups and they had their own way of selecting their candidates. And typically in the past, in the 19th century, this was done through the party bosses. And this is the, stereotypical room filled with a bunch of old men with cigars, filled with smoke, and they pick somebody that they say that's our nominee. So the process was a controlled behind the scenes system, and it wasn't.
That sounds familiar, John, doesn't it?
Right, right. It's not that different still, but it's sort of by the 20th century, there were reforms that were put into place that they started to emphasize the primary campaign. And so the party bosses still had behind the scenes control, but they wanted to have a more election process where they would run for office. And this is kind of paralleling the rise of the 20th century media, going from print media with newspapers into the radio, into television. And so the importance of these nomination processes became parallel to the rise of media, because the media became a big part of the horse race aspect of politics, of
Right.
looking at politics the same way you would look at football or sports, where this person is up this many points and that person, and you have all these polls and going state by state. So that became a big part of the nomination process. But at the same time, the parties, whether or not there was nominations and elections, the parties still had mechanisms by which to control the outcome. And it really came to a big head in 1968. You mentioned this earlier, Will. In 1968, there was Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy, and Humphrey was the one who was popular among the party bosses, the Democratic Party bosses.
Correct.
McCarthy had the anti-war vote, and he actually, I believe, won the nomination.
I think McCarthy placed second in New Hampshire,
Okay.
and the contest after I'm sure most of the baby boomer generation will know this because it's so relevant to how we came into politics. But
Yeah.
as soon as it became apparent that an anti-war candidate could challenge a sitting Democratic president and nearly defeat him. I don't believe McCarthy defeated Johnson in New Hampshire. He lost by like 2 points, but he almost defeated him. As soon as that happened, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was supporting the incumbent president, changed his mind, and he was attacked as being an opportunist. Jumped in and said, "I'm going to be the anti-war candidate now." And Robert F. Kennedy jumped into the race, and then it became sort of a horse race between Robert F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. And Humphrey was nowhere to be found. And as a result of McCarthy's efforts to near defeat of Lyndon Johnson, Johnson pulled out of the race, like the way Biden has recently pulled out. Right. Johnson pulled out of the race. And now it was a race essentially between Robert F. Kennedy, who the McCarthy forces attacked as an opportunist, but Robert F. Kennedy, who emerged as this sort of symbol, both for the anti-war movement, and don't forget, simultaneous to that was the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, now reaching their peaks in 1968. And Kennedy just seemed to capture the imagination of both of these movements. So.
Yeah, and I think that the big takeaway from that I think of is like the Democratic Party still maintained control of the outcome, but they recognize that the voting process is going to cause them a challenge because the people are riled up and are going against the agenda of the party bosses. So they sort of were afraid of the popular discontent that could challenge their leadership. And so that's where they put in place this process called the superdelegates.
Correct.
And
that's what delegate process.
Yeah. And we learned a lot about that because that became more relevant in the last couple elections. But essentially, they sort of had this way where they wanted to say, look, we have a democratic process. You have elections, people can vote, the voters are being heard, but we and the party elite, we still want to be able to control the outcome. So they give a certain segment of delegates super delegate status to mean that they can go against the will of the voters and choose which candidate they want. And so that allows the party leadership to maintain control over the outcome if something like McCarthy were to happen again. And they can push the delegates in the direction they want, regardless of the will of the voters.
Exactly right. So the superdelegates, I guess, consist of, on the one hand, elected public officials who are elected into office, as well as, I guess, party elites or bureaucrats within the Democratic Party. So these are, in other words, these are delegates who are not elected by voters, by Democratic voters.
And on top of that, I think since the 60s, these trends have only increased with the kind of horse race aspect of politics. The media has become even more focused, hyper-focused on political campaigning, so that campaigns are now starting years in advance before the election date. And the media is now, it's not just the news on television, but it's social media. There's sort of 24-hour cycle of focus on the media, on the pundits, on the candidates, who's running, what polling they're doing in each state. And that whole mass media spectacle is something that generates profit and revenue. And at the same time, then the role of money, wealth, and donors has increased as well with the deregulation of financial support for campaigns that the Supreme Court did, I believe, in 2009. With the decision that, basically giving money to a candidate is considered your freedom of speech. So now we can have open campaign bribery for officials. So now with the media and with campaign spending, the political process is almost entirely controlled by big money. So the question is, how can an independent candidate that is a populist candidate that is on the side of the people, how can that sort of candidate break through the Democratic or Republican Party and get through their bureaucracy, get through their nomination process without being foiled by the establishment?
Right. It's almost like a Herculean task that even if a candidate did break through, the system now is so thoroughly corrupted by big money and by the sort of the structural framework that it raises the question: is it reformable?
Do you ever watch the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? The old.
I sure do. It's a wonderful film. I recommend it to anyone.
It kind of reminds me of that because in that movie, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Jimmy Stewart is like appointed as a senator, and he's this young, idealistic man, and then he discovers that the whole system is corrupt and there's all this bribery going on, and he tries to protest it, and they destroy his reputation, and he does this filibuster and it's sort of very idealistic because he beats the corruption just by the force of his convictions and his personality and how great of a filibuster he gave. But when we see this, that movie was in the 30s, and the same thing I think applies to the party process today. If you were one person, one idealistic person, one person who's trying to run, how can you run for office without unlimited funds, without the money, without the party leadership, without the media? So these kind of mechanisms kind of institutionally prevent any sort of honest person from running for office, it would seem.
And worse, not only an honest person, but it just sort of bars. It sort of deletes the whole purpose of electoral politics. In other words, the average citizen can't participate. I mean, they can to the extent, I guess, you could send in a cash donation, if you call that some sort of valued democratic participation, which is about all the average citizen can do. Yeah, I'll send you a check, and that's the nature and extent of civic participation. I mean, that is not the Jeffersonian idea of how citizens are supposed to participate in their government. You're not supposed to write checks. In fact, you shouldn't be writing checks.
Right.
In fact, cash should have nothing to do with it. So there should be almost zero tolerance for any kind of money in civic decisions and civic decision making in a democracy. Money has nothing to do with any of it, and yet there is no other path into the system other than through big money, or, as you say, some individual or personality comes along and says, I'm going to battle all of this and somehow change it and overcome it. And in 50 years, it has not happened.
Well, that's the problem, though, with this whole Supreme Court decision, Citizens United.
Citizens United, correct.
That said, giving money to a campaign is tantamount to freedom of speech. But the problem with that is if you're an ordinary citizen and you give $20 to a candidate, that's not the same level of free speech, let's say, as a billionaire oligarch who can give $100 million to a campaign. So the level of influence is completely disproportionate, that renders the ordinary citizen completely meaningless or completely voiceless almost.
Right, and the reports are that these elected officials spend most of their day what they call dialing for dollars. They spend the day on the phone all day calling potential campaign contributors or donors, wealthy individuals, and asking for money. It's such a corrupt system that it's hard to even understand how it has anything to do with democracy or democratic values or citizen participation or civic virtues. It has nothing to do with it. It's a corrupted system.
And I think, I mean, from the perspective of the party leadership, that is how they sort of want it to work. They want to have a veneer of democracy, a veneer of representation when in reality that veneer of representation is masking the fact that the two-party system in the United States serves the capitalist class. It serves the wealthy, the powerful, the bankers, the war profiteers. That's who is really the one that has the influence and say over the party nomination, not the ordinary voters, but they still try to maintain a sense of popular legitimacy. And I think what we've been seeing since probably 2016 with the Sanders versus Clinton, that was, I think, significant because that was the moment when there was a strong primary challenge to the establishment. And even though it failed, it did open the eyes, I think, of a lot of people in the country to see just how corrupted the entire process was. And almost it make us question whether it's reformable at all.
Right, exactly. And that veneer also ultimately translates into a deformed platform and policies. In other words, you have Bernie Sanders saying we need Medicare for all, universal health care for every citizen of the nation. Everyone's covered with a national health insurance or Medicare for all or Social Security for all program. Then because the veneer is constantly compromised, the policies are constantly compromised. You see the evolution of that position to subsequent positions like, well, okay, we can't have Medicare for all, but maybe we could have expanded Medicaid for poor people only. In other words, those who deserve health care will get it, but not everyone will get it. And then right up to the current day, where you have the main health care initiative being, we're going to get you lower cost insulin for your diabetes. Right. So you go from universal Medicare for all to a discount on your insulin. So that's how the veneer, the veneer, as you call it, plays out in terms of policies and programs. Right. And the question becomes: is this enough? For people who desire change and want true citizen participation, are these ever decreasing sort of scraps enough, or when do you say enough is enough, and we need a new approach and a new strategy and a new ideology if we're ever going to change this system, because it's a structural problem.
I totally agree, and I think the 2016 election for me, it showed that the superdelegates, the party leadership, the establishment, the media, they all conspired to rig the election against Sanders. But the big failure of Sanders was that he basically rolled over and endorsed Clinton, and his entire movement and the money he raised from all of these supporters and everyone that campaigned for him, he just shoved them back into the same party that he said we should have a political revolution against.
That's right.
Corrupt party. Hillary Clinton is a corrupt politician, but now I want you to support this corrupt party. And he did that in 2016. He ran again in 2020. And again, they used anti-democratic mechanisms to stifle him. And again, he said, okay, you screwed me over, but I'm going to tell the people to vote for the corrupt system that I said we should revolt against. That's right. And in 2024, he kind of is now, I don't know what he's doing. He's sort of a lapdog, I guess, for the
But at the same time, you could see the value of his strategy. In other words, when Sanders looked like he was competitive and he did have at least a possibility of being competitive to achieve the Democratic Party nomination, you saw how effective, how dramatic the progressive position suddenly became, because he operated within the Democratic Party, and it appeared he could actually take the nomination and actually run for president of the United States. That's the virtue of saying, should we work within the Democratic Party? Because those who seem to become most effective, at least in terms of media attention and so forth, are in fact perhaps the AOCs or the Bernie Sanders, because they're working within the structure that controls the electoral process and the election system, which is the duopoly. So they seem, at least on the surface, to be on the one hand most effective, but on the other hand, as you point out, in the end, the structure defeats them or corrupts them. So that's the
Yeah, and I think
that's the question. That's the question, though.
yeah, well, I don't know. I would question how effective they are. I mean, they are effective in terms of their success and their ability to be part of the national agenda and conversation. But in terms of actually achieving any successes, we are no closer today to any of the New Deal policies that Bernie Sanders advocated for than we were 8 years ago. And AOC is arguably even worse than Bernie, and she's completely capitulated to the Democratic Party establishment on virtually every issue, including she even denounced Medicare for all. So, and of course, both Bernie and AOC and the squad are pretty openly pro-war in terms of Ukraine and Syria and China and other issues. So it's sort of like, are these candidates truly able to use the Democratic Party as a revolutionary vehicle, or are they simply, a Pied Piper that's leading the candidates into the Democratic fold,
Right.
and preventing that, public dissatisfaction with the system from going into another direction that would truly be a new party that could actually change things. And I think that's the big problem with the thing. I mean, because it's like Bernie Sanders tried it once, he tried it twice. Both times the same outcome happened. So we're now in 2024, they didn't even have a primary at all. They just dropped Biden, and by all accounts, it seems like Biden was kind of forced out from within, and then they just anointed Kamala Harris as the nominee without anyone voting for Harris at all. So we sort of just skipped the entire primary process, and we're sort of back to that 19th century, smoke-filled room with old men with cigars who just pick somebody.
That's right. And so I guess what you're saying is the purpose now of these so-called reformers or so-called progressives is simply to sort of shuttle the masses, in a sense, back into this structurally defective, anti-democratic, and corrupt system. They shuttle you back in because there's no place else to go. So their job becomes to purge you back and say, well, we're going to offer you the veneer of a prospect of some kind of progressive result. And as I explained, the veneer keeps dwindling down with smaller and smaller crumbs. But the structure is never reformed. The essential corrupt structure, the money, corporate sponsored, big money based structure in which the whole system operates is never changed. The superdelegate, anti-democratic superdelegate system is not, well, they had efforts to try to change it during the Sanders campaign. But again, as you point out, it's clearly still there and not fully not reformed by any means. And that becomes their role. So yeah, and ergo the question you pose, is the Democratic Party reformable? Initially, when we started our conversation, I would say, well, only history can determine that. I mean, it's reformable when it's reformed. In other words, if someone actually can do it, or a movement can do it, then yes, it is reformable. But if a movement cannot do it, then it's not reformable. I mean, I think history probably would judge that, or the progressive leaders or vanguard would address that question.
I think that the closest time in history when the Democratic Party was doing something progressive was probably the 1930s under FDR, the New Deal, and during World War II. And that was a very historic time. We had the Great Depression, you had the threat of fascism, and you also had the Popular Front, which is the Communist Party, was also aligned with the Democratic Party in a sense, in favor of this anti-fascist movement. and this sort of trade unions, labor unions, working class parties. So there was a lot of energy, and remember FDR himself, he was not a revolutionary or a communist, but he was trying to take on the corporate elites and the oligarchs in the party in order to pass the New Deal. So at the time, that was probably the closest we ever had to sort of, any sort of hope for change within the party. But I think since then, I don't think that the Democratic Party can be a vehicle for any sort of actual revolutionary transformation. I think what the Democratic Party wants to do is they recognize that people in society are discontent with the way things are going. So they want people like a Bernie Sanders or an AOC, because that is like a public figure, a personality that seems like, oh, this is a socialist. So you vote for that person and that makes you feel better. But in the end of the day, those so-called socialists in the party don't actually do anything to help the people. They just keep they keep us tied to that same corrupt system.
Correct. Yeah, that's well stated. That's what's happening. Also, I would again inject into your analysis there what took place during the '60s and the anti-Vietnam War movement and Black Power movement. I mean, that I think was probably the second major uh, historical period of reform where there really was a national anti-war movement that was extremely, organized on well, not so much organized, but that existed, and also a Black Power movement
We could probably consider, and some people have said that consider the America has had three revolutions: the first revolution against the British monarchy, and then the anti-slavery revolution against slavery, and then the civil rights movement as a revolution. So I think that's correct that the '60s we had a revolutionary energy at that time.
Right, and you had reformers who did attempt to work within the Democratic Party. You had Tom Hayden, who was one of the architects of the Students for Democratic Society,
Yes.
and you had Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, and there were other union leaders like Cesar Chavez. And black leaders like Jesse Jackson and others who were really fighting, believed that the party could be reformed and that these progressive forces could win the party, could change the structure. And that's always an ongoing debate. It's sort of it's always prevalent. Is this the right thing to do? Should we even attempt to participate in the party and make these reforms, or should we just do the opposite and say no more of this after this 50 or longer year of reform attempts?
Yeah, and with respect to Michael Harrington and the Democratic Socialists of America, I think their strategy has not succeeded because in the past 50 years, America is actually, like you said, we're not closer to socialism. We're more, in this neoliberal age of austerity where we're fighting over smaller and smaller scraps than ever before. So I think I lean towards this idea of, going back to Lenin and having an actual revolutionary communist party that is going to be working to build the working class, the masses, in a truly revolutionary fashion, and not keep going down this path of forever trying to reform the Democratic Party. Because I think we've tried it, if we've done it since the '60s and it hasn't happened, I am not sure that it's gonna, be
Right.
a proper vehicle to change anything.
Right, and I because my sort of initiation into progressive reform is the anti-war and Black Power movements. I would propose that that both of those movements again sort of spearhead or be that sort of the central focus of a progressive movement. So that's where I would sort of place my my proposal.
Well, I think that's a good point to conclude the episode. Next week, we are going to talk more about these issues and particular go into the question of personality politics, because we have discussed the role of the media in elevating personalities and focusing on individualism over politics and over ideology and over policies and issues. So that's going to be our next episode. But that's it for today. We really thank you for tuning in to the Praxis Report. We're here to connect theory to action. And if you enjoyed our discussion today, please don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and we look forward to you joining us next time so we can help stay engaged, stay informed, and keep challenging the status quo together. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for being with us. Peace, y'all.